John, the Magna Carta is one of those elusive, mysterious historical things that's treated a bit like Moses' stone tablets. Firstly, what is the Magna Carta? Where did it come from? And why did you decide to make it the topic of your co-authored book?
We decided to write about the Magna Carta on the 800th anniversary of its agreement back in 1215. And what we wanted to do was educate Australians, and now the book is sold worldwide, not just about our history, but about some really important principles that we need to fight for and that we need to understand. So the idea that the king is subject to the people is very important. The idea that we have the rule of law whereby someone can't be imprisoned without a trial, the idea that all of us are subject to the law are really important issues that we still live with every single day. So that's what motivated us to go back and explain in layperson's terms what the Magna Carta was and is and why it's relevant. So in very simple terms, Alexandra, it was an agreement between King John and some barons who had rebelled against his high tax policies. So where have we heard that before? And they were engaged in a revolt against his rule to settle the debate, the argument, the civil war. The barons and King John came together at a place called Runnymede on the banks of the Thames in June 1215, and they agreed to a deal whereby the king promised not to tax outrageously. The barons promised to behave. They put in a whole series of provisions about the rule of law, as I said, and which we can talk about. And as usually happens in agreements between governments and barons or governments and the people, within a few months, it was ripped up. It was null and void. The barons were back engaging in civil war against King John. He was to die the following year. But the significance of the Magna Carta and what had happened in 1215 is that future kings realised that if they were to rule with the consent of barons and ultimately rule with the consent of people, they would have to continue to make the sorts of promises that were embodied in the Magna Carta. And then over the years, the Magna Carta became more and more influential, not just for what it actually said, but what it was meant to symbolise, and came to a fore in the English Civil War, in the debate between the Parliament and King Charles I, whereby the Parliament said, you can't levy taxes without our permission, and the King paid for that debate with his head. And ever since the English Civil War, the Magna Carta has been a touchstone for the sorts of rights and liberties that we think are so important. So it's been taken to now represent the importance of the freedom of the press and freedom of the debate, rule of law. As I said, the idea that the Parliament has the King subject to it, or in these days, the Prime Minister or the Executive, and also the idea that we all have access to justice. So at very many levels, the Magna Carta was significant for 800 years.
Is it a single document? Is it a book? I mean, a lot of people have never seen it. They don't know what it looks like. Do we still have a copy of it?
Fantastic question. So the Magna Carta today, as we understand it, so it's called the Great Charter to distinguish it from a few other agreements that had been made basically in relation to forests and woodland, which was a key issue for debate between barons and kings.
The Robin Hood thing, the whole forest in England was a very, very contentious topic between kings and the peasantry, that's for sure.
Absolutely, and that's where firewood came from, where fuel came from, and of course, where food came from. So the Magna Carta is about 3,000 words in Latin. It's written on parchment, on sheepskin, and it was, if you were to write it out, it would take about 8 hours. There are 4 extant original copies of the Magna Carta back from 1215. We don't know whether there was ever a single document that had been agreed between the barons and King John, but what we have now are 4 copies, 2 in the British Library, a copy in Salisbury and a copy in Lincoln. in the UK. And we then have other reissues of the Magna Carta in the centuries after, and there's even a copy of the Magna Carta from about 100 years later in our parliament here in Canberra. People think the Magna Carta was signed, and we tend to say that Magna Carta was signed by the King. Well, it wasn't. There's no evidence that King John could write. It was sealed with a piece of wax. And when the Magna Carta was agreed upon, we assume there were several dozen copies at the time, and it was sent all through the kingdom and read out to local communities as a symbol of the agreement between the barons and the king, and as a way of calming, as I said, what was a difficult situation because England was in civil war. So today we have 4 original copies left.